My frustration only continues as I see the inability of the American right to analyze our political systems with any form of objectivity. And though the right claims its conservatism is in opposition to liberalism, they can't divorce their analytical perspective from the broad assumptions of our liberally founded society. Liberalism is fundamentally trying to produce a system that is impartial to its operators. In its perfect and theoretical form, liberalism should be able to withstand any level of societal shift without ever requiring an update. It theorizes itself as the ideal framework for civilization, totally irrespective of the people, place, or culture it actually governs. As it continues to strip away bonds, it hopes to return us to what it declares to be the natural state of man. But much like the modernist art movement's pursuit for objectively beautiful art led to maniacs like Pierre Mondrian tearing the stove out of his apartment because the burner coils were circular and not square, liberalism will continue doubling down on its reductive quest, because there are no limiting principles which would classify certain things or bonds as inherently off limits. The ideology promotes nothing but a strict adherence to its own neutrality. It is unable to recognize our duties as people. Liberalism could never direct you to hold an obligation to your parents, siblings, or any family member. Carl Benjamin concisely repudiates this with his instruction for you to simply pick up the phone and call your mother, because we all realize that we do have this familial obligation regardless of what some political ideology would imply. If liberalism can't even recognize something as basic and fundamental to humans as family, then it obviously doesn't have an accurate assessment of the natural state of humans. And we are now at the point where the contradiction between how liberalism views man and how man actually is has started to cause a societal breakdown. And just like anything built upon an improper foundation, it will eventually fall if enough overwhelming force is applied. We are at that stage where an overwhelming force is indeed breaking our foundation, as we are flooded with immigrants who neither share our ethnicity nor values, yet we can't figure out a way to justifiably update our society to even stop it. This is because we have become deferential to the systems which govern us. There is no room for logic here, because to even contest the framework could remove the load-bearing mythology of America that so many have bought into, and this faction of the right refuses to contemplate the possibility that our governing system and ideology may have some incorrect assumptions. When this mythology is held onto, these people seem to forget that our entire system was invented to help us prosper. It was not intended to become the final arbiter of everything, and it was certainly not created to endlessly expand its prevalence without regard to what it's doing to our reality. We were not created to serve liberalism. It was devised to serve us, just like capitalism, democracy, and any other general operating system of our society. We are not in service to any of them. They are in service to us, and if they are failing us, we have to be able to adjust or we will perish. The discussion of the US Constitution seems to be the topic that animates those who believe in the mythical version of America the most, because anytime I or any of the actual prominent right-wing voices reasonably mention the possibility that the Constitution may not be an infallible document, those who have been deeply propagandized are reflexively repulsed, because they've been led to believe that these works are to be depended on without any regard for what they produce. It has become a religious devotion. And Aaron McIntyre gave a great description of exactly what I mean on Timcast recently.
This is really critical, and this is what I want establishment conservatives to understand. Look, I grew up on talk radio conservatism. I totally understand these pitches. I believe all these pitches. I'm familiar with what they're saying. When you turn the Constitution into a deity, when you deify the Constitution, you make it the central identity, you create a scenario where people are just fighting over the meaning of the words so they can control the definition. Mm-hmm. A Constitution is not some contract that's written up that then defines the country. A Constitution is a reflection of the way that the people are constituted. It is the way that they live their lives, their traditions, their beliefs, their values, their heritage, their language, their understanding. The Constitution doesn't make the people. The people make the Constitution. So the Constitution only works when the people are already living in the way that the Constitution lays out for them. That's what makes a republic, because they are people who are self-governing. They are living in the way of tradition, and no one needs to come in and tell them how to live their lives and dictate to them each move, because they already have such a tightly woven cultural identity that everything is second nature. They govern themselves, which is to say the community governs. It is tied to those traditions and those beliefs. The Constitution has never and will never compel people to live in a particular way. And when you turn the Constitution into this, the thing that defines you as a people, then it's just about arguing over what that document means. And that's why we've so radically changed what the country is, because we abstracted ourselves into this legal definition that can be manipulated by people making arguments rather than tying it to actual beliefs, actual religion, actual tradition.
Before we look at this clip, some of you may have seen the recent video I did on Gen Z's shift to the right was published as an article on Arktos Journal's Substack. And I'll be partnering with them going forward, with some of the scripts of my videos being posted in written form there, like my Ben Shapiro essay coming up next, but I also plan to write articles specifically for publication as essays. And Arktos has just released 3 new books which I want to help promote. The first is out now, entitled Legitimate Preference, Reclaiming the Right to One's Own by Tim Vorgans, with a foreword by Jared Taylor, and it focuses on the importance of European identity and why it is absolutely okay and acceptable to be pro-European as well as pro-white. The next is called White Privilege by George Giscard, releasing on Thursday, November 27th. This book traces the entire narrative of white privilege from its Marxist origins and how it transformed the original class struggle into a racial struggle used to denigrate and demoralize Europe and its culture. The last is titled The Sweden Syndrome by Carol Olav Arnsberg, and it argues just how the Swedish elite have succumbed to the view that all outgroups are inherently oppressed, and the only way to resolve this is Sweden's self-dissolution in the service of suicidal multiculturalism. And the link to find all these books will be in the description as well as in the pinned comment. And on December 3rd for White Wednesday, Arktos will be partnering with Antelope Hill Publishing and Above Time Coffee Roasters for a site-wide sale. Arktos will be offering 20% off their catalog. So please go support Arktos and all the great outlets publishing important work for the movement. But back to the video. This deification Oren talks about is the very thing that has withheld genuine moves to make modifications to our system. This idea that the way we structured our society, which was done prior to the Industrial Revolution, wouldn't ever need a substantive update is so absurd it's hard to believe it actually needs to be said. Yet that is exactly what liberalism pursues, a permanent, universal system that should never require adjustment. Couple that with a mythological belief in it, and this reaction becomes entirely predictable. This is of course also a natural human instinct. We would all like the permanence of ideal conditions, but we have to be able to recognize this as an impulse and not as a virtue or a legitimate strategy. And what I see primarily happening on the right is that exact conflation. The unconditional surrender to our systems has been treated as a noble act. How many times have you seen someone that would describe themselves as a constitutional conservative say something along the lines of, well, that's up to the judicial system to decide. He'll need his day in court. And the implication here is that a trial by jury has some magical power to definitively decide on whether justice has been served. Now, I clearly concede that this type of system has the capacity for this to be the case, but the important distinction is that these people will view the outcome the system produces as legitimate regardless of any other factors. But if we decide as a society that Derek Chauvin is guilty of murder purely because of his jury's verdict, we no longer have any moral agency. And so we simply cannot continue to only defer to whatever the system says for our conclusions. The new right has mostly adjusted their framework here. We understand and accept that our systems serve us, we do not serve systems. But I've seen many right-wing commentators concede on things like banning pornography merely because someone at some point argued that it's a form of free speech, and thus that would make it constitutionally protected. And this is a clear example of what I'm talking about. We are pretending that our systems decide what we can put up with rather than ourselves. It's a paternalistic concession, literally based on faith, that trusts the system to be self-resolving and essentially infallible. But there is no system, no matter how perfect, that is self-resolving. You will always be pulling weeds no matter how perfect your garden looks at the moment. Once we properly rid ourselves of the notion that we need to trust the system to fix itself, we can actually work on adjusting the function of our program to serve the outcomes we want. But this should not be taken as an argument that the ends always justify the means. We're still obligated to adhere to moral principles, but assuming that satisfied, we can change things. And we should no longer be required to just accept any sort of loophole as legitimate just because some highly contested definitional interpretation of a document at one time said it was okay. We are actually obligated to change an improperly performing system. but the first step in taking corrective action is to accurately assess how the program truly works and why it is failing. And Niccolo Machiavelli was the most successful articulator of this process, but many still don't actually understand him because he's almost universally referenced in a negative way. But if you read The Prince, it's very clear that Machiavelli hardly makes any value judgments on his perceptions. The book is a study on power and politics, not a manifesto. It's political science, not political judgment. And this is the same approach taken by James Burnham in both his books The Managerial Revolution and The Machiavellians. In The Managerial Revolution, Burnham exhaustively clarifies that his theory for how society would evolve was not what he prefers, but just what he sees as the likely progression of capitalism based on the existing evidence. These types of analyses are an attempt to understand what is actually happening. They try to apply impartiality to their historical review to uncover the true operating mechanisms. If for some reason every king to ever take power had killed their brother, then it's a reasonable conclusion to draw that the action is probably a prerequisite to the crown. And there's nothing wrong with evaluating something in this manner. It is in fact the most necessary approach to take, because if you don't diagnose the situation correctly, your proposed solution will almost never work. Just as we've seen with liberalism's incorrect assessment of the nature of man, resulting in eventual systemic failure as a consequence. But now the next step is to properly identify where it went wrong. And we can only do this if we drop this deification of our systems that Aaron and many others have identified. We have to abandon the assumption that an accurate analysis is always a value judgment. A great example of the right's inability to do this was put on display when Nick Fuentes made his seemingly positive comments about Joseph Stalin. And the histrionic response from Con Inc. was so embarrassing I still can't tell if they're all simply stupid liars or both. But Fuentes' actual point was that Stalin probably amassed more power than any human ever has. And that's an impressive accomplishment regardless of his use of that power or his ideology. The achievement is stunning in objective terms, just as Usain Bolt's 100-meter dash is undeniably spectacular. It's not an endorsement or justification for Stalin's actions to say this. The same can even be said about Gaddafi's seizure of control over Libya at the age of 27. But just as any criticism of our liberal system is immediately written off as heretical, the achievements of these men are often denounced as worthless just the same because their methods were not in line with the load-bearing mythical liberal ethic. But the immediate rejection and inability to assess the accomplishments is exactly the opposite of what Machiavelli's analytical procedure would result in. There is zero downside to gaining a deeper, more factual understanding of how these men operated. Because if we are interested in winning and not merely being proud of our virtue signaling as we shout condemnation for already nearly unanimously unpopular leaders, then we need to study what makes a successful bid for power regardless of what was done with that authority. With that same objectivity, we also need to assess our systems in a manner that tells us what is genuinely going wrong, no matter which document happens to require criticism. Nothing is above this type of review. And this consistent pearl clutching we see as a response to the critiques is now the most obvious indicator of someone who is incapable of having a serious conversation about actually moving forward. These grifters either want to advertise themselves as good people or they're too propagandized to even attempt an objective review. Either way, if they fail to provide a legitimate assessment, their comments are irrelevant to the actual conversation that we need to be having.